welcome everyone, and it's encouraging to see many familiar faces here and also new faces, but I think it's a testament to the good work that EFSAS, Junaid and his team are doing. Okay, I want to start with a sort of outsider looking in view of Pakistan and its strategic interests and how Pakistan as a nation state views its priorities. And the first one is to really put forward the position that India is seen as a sort of permanent foe, the eternal enemy. And this is something that I think individuals in the West sometimes struggle to rather grasp. I remember seeing General Musharraf speak in London, and he spoke an enormous amount about what he saw India as being up to in Afghanistan, to an audience that really wanted to hear what he was doing to fight Al-Qaeda. But the priorities were really quite distinct. With regards to Kashmir, historically, as you see in the recent book by Keisling on the ISI, Pakistan's goal has been to internationalise the conflict. And the belief is that through that, India will move towards the negotiating table. There's also a desire to ensure that the country has strategic depth, that it doesn't face a challenge or perceived challenge on either flank. So it seeks to maintain influence, looks for a compliant government in Afghanistan. Now, the next element that I would flag up, and something particularly relevant with Imran Khan, you can see in the background of my slide there, is Pakistan has looked to uphold its interpretation of Islamic values, both at home and abroad. And two early indications of this in Imran Khan's period of leadership. Firstly, the appointment and then cancellation of the role of economic advisor for an American-based Pakistani economist who's an Ahmadi. And I think it's significant that it really a significant example, I think, of poor governance, that having offered such a position to somebody, it was then withdrawn. Far easier to either not make the offer or, having found a man who's the right man for the job, to stand by your person. And neither really were taken. Some of the British Islamists that I follow on social media, I think, were also enthused by what appeared to be a subtle reference by Imran Khan, potentially to Afia Siddiqui, a Pakistani scientist in prison in America. They seemed to see that comments he'd made about supporting Pakistanis in trouble abroad was a reference to her. And as we know, the American president, the author of Art of the Deal, I'm not sure that he's particularly likely to be dealing with Imran Khan on Afia Siddiqui. Pakistan also seeks to protect its nuclear capacity, its nuclear capability. But I think on all of these issues which I flagged up there, it's not clear to what extent yet Imran Khan is his own man and can take decisions that potentially may be disagreed with either by the army or the ISI. Now, I want to say a few things about the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights report on Kashmir. And you'll see in my picture there Prince Hussein of Jordan, the now former High Commissioner. And his report, it needs to be stressed, wasn't one that was based on direct on-the-ground interviews in Kashmir. And been some issues around the weighting of the report. I've got other criticisms that I'll come on to. But in reading it, it does remind me of something like an Amnesty International report about a particular country. Long list of actual and unalleged abuses. But the weight is very much towards picking out abuses on Indian territory. And I think there's a reason for that. That it's much harder to ask questions and develop intelligence either in Pakistan or from Pakistan, where civil society is arguably and indeed democratic institutions are arguably weaker. and the report doesn't really go there at all with regards to China. I think it's potentially possible India will be a victim of lawfare as it's known in the future. I don't think there's much chance of Pakistan or China being a victim of those tactics. As a terrorism studies academic, one of the things I particularly want to talk about is the rather curious terminology which appears throughout the report, where terrorist groups, including groups categorised as terrorists by the United Nations, become merely armed groups. Okay? Particularly, at best, neutral language, at worst, wishy-washy. And two examples I pick out from the report. Since the late 1980s, a variety of armed groups have been operating in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. And that is a considerable understatement when you read about the nature of these organisations. Secondly, the killing of Burhan Wani of the Hizbul Mujahideen group is referred to, again, as member of an armed group being killed during an armed clash. So extremely neutral language at best, at worst, wishy-washy. And there's a real, there's a sort of moral equivalence here where members of jihadist organisations are referred to in equal terms to the security forces. And I think that's problematic. And even more so when you consider that the OHCHR report is referring to groups like Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taibah, the Army of Muhammad group, JEM, who are all designated as terrorists by the United Nations. And you can go on the UN website and indeed see that there. Now, when we're discussing terrorism, and when we're discussing counter-terrorism, I do think that language matters. If we were to go back a couple of decades or so to the conflict in Northern Ireland, you could very quickly tell which side somebody was from, which side somebody was sympathetic to, by how they referred to Northern Ireland. So we're talking about Northern Ireland, are almost certainly a loyalist or somebody who's British or supports of the British state. We talked about the 6 counties, you could tell instantly that person was a Republican, most likely sympathetic to Sinn Féin, IRA, etc., etc. So these terms, the terminology, give you a clue as to the author's affiliation or the speaker's affiliation. If we think back to the early days after 9/11, I think the American government took a much more cautious steps than people sometimes think in terms of the language it was using. Probably right up until what's seen as a big blunder, George W. Bush's use of the term crusade. And that was immediately leapt upon by opponents, by Islamist organisations across the world to say, this isn't about responding to 9/11, this isn't about responding to 9/11, it's a crusade, it's the return of the Middle Ages, it's a war against all Muslims, etc., etc. And I think ever since then a real caution has gripped how the authorities speak about terrorism, and they've been very open to what's sometimes determined lobbying from Islamist organisations on terminology. So certainly in the UK, the Muslim Council of Britain, which is a Jamaat Islami affiliated organisation, very close links to the Indian subcontinent, as far back as the late 1990s, was trying to influence how bodies like the Metropolitan Police, how the security services, how the media, how politicians referred to terrorism. And there's a joint statement by the MCB and the Metropolitan Police back in 2000. And these are issues I talked about in detail in my PhD, and will do in my forthcoming book on British jihadism. People have sought to, if you like, neutralise and pacify the language of terrorism and counter-terrorism, and indeed been very successful in doing so. And I think the language used in the UN report is just a worrying example of that. We've most recently seen Max Hill, the UK's independent reviewer of counter-terrorism legislation, berate politicians in the House of Commons for using terms such as Islamist or such as jihadist about organisations who openly describe themselves in that way. So I think we are potentially moving towards a situation now where any ideological affiliation is removed from how we discuss terrorist actors, apart strangely from the far right. For some reason, perhaps because nobody lobbies on their behalf, but in the UK they are still given that affiliation by the authorities. To show you how problematic, though, the language in the UN report is, I want to just refer back to Pervez Musharraf's admissions of late 2017, discussing the armed groups in Kashmir, discussing Lashkar-e-Taibah, and he says that, yes, they are involved there. There, it is between us and India. I was always in favour of action. And they are the biggest force to suppress the Indian army in Kashmir. So what we have here is in practice a proxy war, a proxy conflict. Armed actors encouraged by one nation state operating on the territory of another. I think we need to go a little bit further than the categorisation given in the report when you take that background in. And indeed this is something that's been covered by a series of academics and specialists going right back to the late 1980s. The importance of this issue also pivots around the fact that the United Nations as an organisation wishes to play a greater role in countering terrorism. And I think that's something that we should broadly welcome. Last year at SOAS University of London, where I teach, we had the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, speak, and he stressed very much that he wants to see a legal and human rights-based approach to terrorism. And again, that is a positive. But it also comes with real challenges, because if you're going to take that approach, it's very easy to fall into the trap of launching detailed critiques of the countries that it is easiest to criticise, of the democratic nations in particular, and avoiding those countries where it's too difficult or too dangerous to ask hard questions, or where civil society's weak. I could very easily mention Russia as easily as Pakistan or China, etc., etc. there. It's important to take a critical approach towards terrorist actors and their sponsors. A proxy war needs to be identified as such. And when you're looking at the recommendations in the OHCHR report, that is absent. Something else that's also absent is a section on China. Absolutely glaring omission. There are 7 passing references, but this is not a report that gets down and dirty with the detail. And I think that's a real disappointment. And I think if there's a winner from the Prince Hussein report, it wasn't the people of Kashmir, it was probably the Pakistani State. Been dancing in the streets of Islamabad. Thank you, everyone.